explain to me what human trafficking is, and you have a real distinction between some areas. Tell me what, in your opinion.
Sure. So human trafficking is pretty broad, right? It's the exploitation, usually the movement and exploitation of humans for their labor. A small portion of human trafficking involves sex trafficking, although what we see most on media and film is this sort of sensationalized sex slavery or sex trafficking, which does happen, but it's a small piece of this larger picture of human trafficking and exploitation of labor. Well, I mean, if we're going really large, really broad problems, we're talking, generational poverty, classism, racism, sexism, all these things that drive folks to make decisions that are either desperate or put them in positions where they're incredibly vulnerable, so that folks are able to more effectively or more easily exploit their labor, convince them or coerce them to do certain things that turn out to be really different situations than they imagined. So if we're looking at really big picture, we have to address those kinds of inequalities in our sort of society broadly. So sex trafficking is part of this pretty enormous global industry that is the sex trade, right? So there are folks who are consenting adult or volunteer workers who make the choice to do a variety of different kinds of sex work. It could be prostitution, dancing, dominatrixes, all these other different kinds of potential sensual or sexual work. And then there is this portion of those folks who did not make that choice. They were either coerced through violence, through the threat of violence. They were tricked and told a story about what might be happening to them, and then they find themselves somewhere foreign. It usually involves taking someone's wages, often removing their identification, and almost always involves movement, physical movement across borders. It could be international or it could be state borders, but the idea is to remove you from your support system, remove you from folks who you know and trust and who can help you. And they find themselves in these situations in which they have absolutely no power and they're being exploited. And it certainly does happen, but both of those pieces exist within the sex trade more broadly. Folks who do make the choice and folks who don't, but a lot of the legislation that we have affects both of those groups in negative ways. It involves a lot of different elements, whether it's physical violence or just that constant threat of danger and lack of power. Often folks will be forced to, use substances or do a variety of other things. It's really dehumanizing and causes some really complex trauma that can't be dealt with easily or with any sort of quick rescue or fix. So it's a really serious issue, and it causes, complex trauma that can last a lifetime.
How do you know so much about this? What is your personal involvement with this?
So I work really closely with sex workers, largely consenting adult sex workers, but I've also worked my whole career with street-based young people. So folks who are homeless, home-free, a lot of them were LGBTQ identified, and unsurprisingly, a lot of those young folks have experienced some kind of coercion or trafficking. So I sort of study and educate myself and organize around sex worker rights broadly that include the rights of folks who are trafficked or who are trafficking survivors or victims, and also those who might make the choice for whatever reason, that's not mine to decide, to engage in the sex trade. I feel like all human beings deserve sort of basic protections, so I've spent the last 5 or 6 years of my life working with and for this, organizing with this community.
Was there a reason that drew you to this profession? Something?
I mean, there were a lot of reasons. Trauma, right? Trauma is a thread that a lot of us sort of share. I've experienced it in my life, and the young people I've worked with have experienced it in even greater sort of greater amounts and greater frequency. And when I work with those young folks, and when I worked around sort of reproductive justice and women's rights, it becomes, so fundamental, this idea of making choices with one's own body and about one's own life. And I felt really compelled that it was my responsibility as a survivor and as someone who is just plugged in with this community that I find like really fierce and resilient, to stick around and to organize and to work with and for and really try to hear and honor the voices of survivors and sex workers. I mean, there are a lot of stories that people would be pretty horrified about. I'm really careful about utilizing those stories because they're not mine to tell. But I have certainly worked with young folks who, because of their position as racial minorities and also gender or sexual minorities, and without homes, who have been forced through some violence, through removal of their IDs, their working documents, to remain in a home in which clients would come and which they were sort of forced to see these clients daily. Sometimes they wouldn't be fed. If they didn't behave the way they were supposed to, they wouldn't be fed or they wouldn't be given access to the showers. There are horrifying things that happen. But again, I'm really careful sort of moving around that because it's not my story to tell, and I really hope that we're able to connect with and create compassion within this broader community so folks feel more comfortable and safe sharing their stories.
Sure. Is it a problem in the United States? Is human sex trafficking a problem in the United
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a problem the world over. I mean, the sex industry is global, and that means that this smaller portion of the sex industry, folks who are trafficked, is also global. It happens here. We bring folks from other parts of the world that are economically depressed, where folks don't maybe have access to power and resources, and bring them here. We also, recruit young folks in the States and bring them to other parts of the United States, usually, urban areas. And it's often young people who, again, don't have an incredible amount of power, and they're either told stories about what they have to hope for and come with us and we'll help you out, or they're just outright abused, sort of forced in from the start. And coercion is a big piece of that because it can happen through someone's boyfriend who they really care about. It can look really different than what we think it looks like in like film and TV. It can be someone they know well, that they care for, that they even love. And the situations are as numerous as there are like number of people involved. They're very, very different.